Our last conversation was in very dark days, the darkest probably. I felt that our blood was in the water and that we may not be able to bounce back from that and recover our deterrence. And in this neighborhood, as you see now in Syria, in this neighborhood without deterrence, if you are not strong, sooner or later you're dead. And that's how it felt. And we had a hostile American administration, people only now understand how hostile. Those of us who follow American politics knew that it was hostile. We knew that Biden was hugging Netanyahu over the table while kicking his shins under it. And we just didn't know the extent. But they were stepping on our oxygen supply with the embargo on ammunitions. And it was not just the large bombs, it was everything. The army was complaining about the D9s. The D9s are these bulldozers that enable you to approach a building without risking the lives of soldiers by entering it in case it's booby-trapped. So your way to save lives is to bomb from the air, or else, if you can't, or if there's a danger of too many civilian casualties, you use D9s, and we bought D9s. There was 150 D9s, and they wouldn't let us have them. And I heard from people in the army saying, this costs us lives daily, these 150 missing D9s. So the time was really dark. And if you remember, I said that we are facing a decade of wars. Because we will have to break the noose that Iran has been constructing around us. And that it may take a few wars, as it took to break the noose that Nasser tied around us since the mid-50s. And it took 25 years to break Nasser's noose, the pan-Arab construction to destroy the state of Israel. And happily, I was probably wrong about the time. This war, I don't think people, certainly in Israel, where the press is so poisonous, people don't understand the amazing achievements of this war. It was not a success in Gaza. We have a semi-insubordinate brass in the military, and I can talk about that a little bit later, but we have almost destroyed the Shiite axis of evil, as the Prime Minister called it. So we were able to do what I thought would take 10 years. And I remember I said the next war is going to be with Hezbollah, and it's going to be terrible. It's going to be more terrible than any war that we have experienced. That is what we thought when there were 150,000 missiles pointed at us. And I thought that, well, when we finish Gaza, this is going to be the next war. And as bitter as it's going to be, we are going to have to fight it. Because we at no price can we allow this monster to sit on our border, perched over the north of Israel, and knowing the Nazi ideology that they are motivated by. And so we would have to do it, even if the price is 15,000 civilian casualties, as some newspapers predicted. And no one anticipated the beeper. And I remember sitting here in my studio doing the Israel Update podcast with Mike Duran, who called it the grim beeper. And no one imagined that we can turn the tide in this way. So what Netanyahu managed to do in the face of a hostile American administration, and let me point out that no prime minister has ever managed to stand for long to continue a war in the face of American resistance. Whenever we didn't finish the war as quickly as the 6 Days War, or now the destruction of the Syrian army in 2 days, so whenever we didn't finish the job ourselves very quickly, at some point an American administration stepped in and said enough. And then we had to obey. And now we did not. Netanyahu did it very carefully, because the escalation was calculated in a very sophisticated way, because if you escalate by killing someone who's wanted by the United States and has a bounty over their head and the blood of Marines from Beirut, people that have their hands in blood to their elbows. The United States can't criticize you for killing someone that's wanted by the American government. And in that way, Netanyahu managed to escalate slowly, and we have almost destroyed Hezbollah. We have toppled through proxies. By doing that, the Assad regime collapsed, and we took out all the air defenses in Iran. Now the question is, will we finish the job? But that job was, I thought, a job that would take a decade.
And what would finishing the job look like?
First of all, taking out the nuclear program in Iran. People are not aware of it, but when Biden was elected, I thought that the existence of Israel is in serious danger. Because looking in retrospect now, the Iranians had some 500 and something centrifuges for enriching their uranium. They now have over 13,000. That's in 4 years of the Biden administration. This is the advances that they made. If Kamala Harris would have won this election, then the Iranians would have a bomb, unless Israel would defy everyone and do it. And that is really tricky. And here, you know, and we pundits, we talk about this, but the truth is, as we didn't know about the beepers, we do not know what Israel's military capabilities really are. But we do know that it will require a sustained campaign to take out the whole nuclear program in Iran. And that it's very difficult to do it from a distance. And so without American backing, it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. So we are in better shape now. You know, things are developing day to day, so I don't know where the Trump administration would take it, but it will definitely not protect the Iranian nuclear program. So that is the main target. But we also can't have Hezbollah, and we did not finish the job. So I'm still worried that we'll end with half compromises in Lebanon, that we would end in a problematic situation in Syria, where Iran was expelled, but Turkey is now more or less master.
Talk about what's happening right now in Syria. We've seen some really disturbing images coming out of Syria.
Yeah, you know, look at the press. Now everybody's saying that there is a new Jelani. He is appearing now with a tie and a tuxedo. These jihadists, they all share a murderous ideology, and we should not expect from, you know, the brethren of Al-Qaeda and of ISIS anything that is like Western values, Western way of life, nor by the way should we expect to operate vis-a-vis these people with a set of incentives and deterrence that we use in the West. This was our terrible mistake with Gaza. All our intelligence said, they will not want to give up their economic achievements. So these are religious people. They take their religion very, very seriously. And their version of religion is an extremely murderous one and includes this horror show of sadism, which they wallow in. It's just, you look at these pictures, and this is not something that you can operate in Western terms at all. So we've managed to to weaken Iran considerably, including kicking it out of Syria. But now we have Turkey close to our border, and Turkey is actually a more serious thing than Iran. It's a more stable state. It's a more robust economy, and it has a real army. Iran has a missile arsenal, not a real army. So we have to see how to play the new balance, but it's a different world. We thought we were on the verge of being suffocated by the Iranians, and the fact that the world was willing to accommodate them is a frightening lesson about how the West has lost its immune system. It does not recognize pathogens. It does not recognize the forces that are able to destroy it, and it's obsessed with its own conscience instead of looking at the world soberly, so that it became more important to say the right thing than to do the right thing. Grandstanding became more important than taking a moral stand.
That's a really interesting insight, and
I can actually give you a very concrete example. Yigal Karmon, the head of MEMRI, the Middle Eastern Media Research Institute, collected sermons of imams in North America, and that is in the United States and Canada.
Yeah.
And this was very disturbing. About 95% of them, he said, were wildly anti-Semitic, some of them actually inciting to violence against Jews. And he thought Jewish organizations would sound the alarm, but they didn't. Many Jewish organizations were apparently more worried about appearing Islamophobic than they were about warning their own congregations, their own folk, against this looming danger. And he told me, Karmon did, that he managed to get a hearing in the Council of Presidents. And in that conversation, what they were worried about is how he collected the information rather than the content of the information. Did he eavesdrop, and was it collected illegally? It was all taken off the web. He just speaks Arabic. And apparently nobody would touch it. Nobody except the ultra-Orthodox and some on the right. Everyone was so scared of political correctness that they were not willing to say that there is a rising tide of incitement to violence against Jews.
When was this?
The report was, I think, 2020 or even 2019. And then it had a few variations, because then Kamon said to himself, well, maybe if I compile a whole array of hate speech, real hate speech, not microaggression, actual incitement to killing people. If I compile a report that would be right and left, then maybe they would be able to use it, or would have the guts to use it. So he said, okay, there'll be a report now, not just about Islamo-Nazism, but also against neo-Nazis on the right, hatred of gays, hatred of blacks, all this. So he compiled a whole array from what was going on the web, with websites inciting to violence. And still, because Islam was in it, people were not willing to touch it. And it was impossible to report left of center and left. So I don't want to create the impression that the center would. It was only the radical right which would do anything with these reports. And this is the truth. And then we know this phenomenon because, speaking about Yigal Karmon was one of the first to say in 1994, when Yasser Arafat came here, the leader of the Palestinians as part of the Oslo Accords, and he started giving speeches in Arabic calling for jihad against Israel. And this was our peace partner. So he was speaking, half lukewarm peace from one side of his mouth, and then telling his own flock that this is like Hudaybiyah. This is like the agreement that the Prophet Muhammad made with the Jews, only to betray them later. So he was saying to his people, don't worry, it's not really going to be peace. It's just a phase in the war. And Yigal Karmon translated these speeches on clunky old video cassettes, and he brought them to journalists. And one of the most prominent journalists, probably, this is the Tom Friedman of the Israeli press, in the bad sense of the word, I guess, and Nahum Barnea. And Nahum Barnea refused to publish them. He said, and according to Karmon, there's a controversy which Nahum Barnea denies, and I got entangled in this because I published it again, and they threatened me with libel, which never came through. But according to Karmon, Nahum Barnea said to him, there is no such thing as truth. Every news story serves some ideological purpose, and yours serves the enemies of peace. This is how rotten postmodern epistemology in the press has gotten, and he refused to publish it. And then Nahum Barnea said, I never said such a thing. And when I got into this polemic with him, he said, I never said there is no such thing as truth. But he did not deny that he didn't publish the story. So they were protecting the Oslo Accords and the leftist plan of peace. I was a supporter of that, regrettably, of that plan in those days, because we didn't know. We did not know that Arafat was telling to his people that he's lying to us. But they thought that they can preserve and they can sort of bridge an intermediary time of confusion until everybody matures and realizes peace is the only solution. And so if Arafat says this or that thing, we shouldn't be too alarmed by this, but we shouldn't let the public know, because the public is hysterical, untrustworthy, and as you know, these elites think the problem with democracy is citizens. Without citizens, it would all be perfect. The problem is that citizens are proto-fascist by nature, and so you can't let them have the truth. You should give them a vegan diet of news in which they will only be treated to what the elites think that they are capable of digesting.
Is that what happened before October 7th?
I think that the peace mentality has penetrated so deeply that it created a frame of mind in which the overarching assumption is that everybody in the end wants peace. So, as one of my friends is fond of putting it, in every terrorist, there is a small inner Jefferson just struggling to get out. So that if we just create the right conditions, if we just let them prosper economically, then they would all come to see that we all humans share the same goals. And so this assumption led the intelligence here astray to think that economic betterment would bring peace in its fold. But it went so deeply that on the night of October 7th, the night between the 6th and the 7th of October, when all these signs were popping up of an imminent attack.
Signs like what?
Signs like the sudden
SIM card activation.
Activation of the SIM cards.
And so let's just, most people I don't think are aware of this. No. So there were hundreds of SIM cards, Israeli SIM cards that got activated in Gaza the night of October 6th. Yeah. And that would have been for what purpose? So they could communicate when they crossed the border? What would the purpose of that be? There is a Palestinian cell phone company. There are actually two. But you can't be sure that reception inside Israel would be very good. So if you want to invade Israel, you need to use the Israeli cell phone system. And so when they activated a large number of Israeli SIM cards all of a sudden, that was a sign of planning to go into Israel. Now, true, they did it before, and it may have been an exercise. It may have been a rehearsal, but there were other signs. Some of the signs that, for the first time, the leaders of Hamas went into the tunnels, all the way up to Mohammed Def. The exception was Yahya Sinwar. But the intelligence knew that they went underground. But the way this was interpreted by Shabak, and Shabak, the Shin Bet, is responsible for Gaza. It's their turf. That's the intelligence agency.
That's actually the secret police. This is the counterintelligence branch of the FBI. Uh-huh. Now it's supposed to operate inside Israel, but it operates in the territories. So it does Judea and Samaria, and it did Gaza when it was under our control. And after we retreated, they had the advantage in Gaza, and they stayed. It remained their responsibility. So a few things happened with that. One is that they got addicted to technology, like the rest of the army. And as my colleague and co-host of my podcast, Mike Duran, has argued, we thought in terms of Star Wars, and they defeated us with Mad Max, with low tech against high tech. So we thought we had it all figured out, but they were one step ahead of us. And Sinwar understood this very clearly. He knows us very well. He studied in our university while being in our jails, and everything that was operational he communicated in notes, in handwritten notes, because he knew we were listening to his cell phone. So on the cell phone, we got the version that he wanted us to think.
And so but you said that there were signs anyway, despite the fact that there were these very low-tech communications that couldn't be
you can't
intercepted.
hide an invasion of thousands of people. But as I said, the addiction to technology caused Shabak to neglect human sources in Gaza. And we had none. Believe it or not, we had none.
No human sources.
None. While the Mossad knew every time that Nasrallah sneezed in Lebanon, the Shabak was completely blind in Gaza. But it was blinded not just by the obsession with technology, but also with Western assumption and the peace process bias. And so when the signs were accumulating, and there was the SIMS, and the leaders going into the tunnels, there are other signs which are classified and can be mentioned, but there were clear signs. Then the interpretation that Shabak came up with was that they are getting prepared for an Israeli invasion. And therefore, this is mind-boggling, and therefore we should not raise the alert, because that would only make them more nervous. This is how our soldiers got slaughtered in their beds, because the Shabak recommended to the army, this is according to a Shabak person that I interviewed on my podcast, the Shabak recommended to the army not to raise the alert so as not to accidentally stumble into escalation.
When you say raise the alert, that you mean not to raise the threat level in the IDF and bring soldiers to the border.
Not even to wake up the soldiers who are sleeping. The tanks were empty. When there's such an alert, soldiers should be sitting inside the tanks with the engines running. But their assumption was that they have this term called miscalculation. There would be a miscalculation on our side, and so we will accidentally start a war. So there are other ways to tell the enemy that that your posture is defensive and not offensive. You can raise your level of alert and tell the enemy that you're not preparing for any invasion. Instead, my interpretation of this, Pamela, is like they said, let's show them our exposed throat so they know that we have no hostile intentions. This is the frame of mind of the peaceniks, who don't understand what enemy we are facing. And so these people, the recommendation of Shabak to the IDF, according to my source, and it was reported through other sources too, was that the army should just be quiet and not even tell its own soldiers to just not to stay sleeping in their beds where they were slaughtered. And now we have all these inquiries coming out, and both Shabak and the IDF are regrettably trying to cover this up.
Well, so let's talk about that report. The way that I read the summary, of course it's translated from Hebrew into English for me to read the summary, and the way that I've seen some other people talk about the summary in English, seems like Shabak and the IDF are admitting that they completely failed to recognize the signs that their what is it called, the concepcia, was this conception that they had about what was going on blinded them, and so they didn't properly interpret the signs. And you would say that's accurate, but there's also your interpretation of this is that they're avoiding taking responsibility. Why is that?
Because what they are trying to, the heart of the failure is that Shabak and IDF is the heart of the failure. And they're trying to deflect everything to what's most convenient for them, is that it was an intelligence failure and the conceptia was responsible. They are also trying to shift the blame to politicians. So the Shabak report, or what we have only a press release, it's not the actual report, is an invented narrative in which they lie to your face, saying that after Shomer Chomot, Guardian of the Wall, the operation in May 2021, the Shabak assessed that Hamas has won that round. And ever since, it has been warning the elected officials of the impending dangers and demanding action. This narrative is false on both sides.
I didn't see that.
We have Nadav Argaman on record saying that Israel landed such a blow on Hamas that Hamas, after Guardian of the Wall, is not the same Hamas. Clearly, Shabak said that we won that round. So that part of the narrative is blunt lie. The second part is that they kept warning, and they didn't see it coming on that night, but they thought that we need to take action. Shabak repeatedly assessed that what we should do is more economic concessions to Hamas, more Gazans coming inside Israel to work. Repeatedly they said this. They said this in the week leading to October 7. And there is nothing in that report saying, why did you not wake up the prime minister? But no, this is the same frame of mind. They're attuned to the fantasy that if we aggravate the enemy, then we will start a war accidentally. So they're not seeing the enemy as hostile enough, as in its true colors. And it's the same thing, it's the same way that they see this government. In their eyes, this government is composed of wild messianic right-wingers who are liable to miscalculation. And so if you read that report carefully, the only hint of what actually happened is this one sentence that they say that they were afraid of a miscalculation. So Ronen Bar, the head of the Shabak, and Herzi Halevi, the chief of staff of the IDF, decided on that night that A, there is no real impending danger, and secondly, that you must not bring the raw data to elected politicians because they are liable to miscalculation and they will, God forbid, start a war. If you look at the whole trajectory of this war, Netanyahu was not only defying the Americans, he was overruling his own staff in the IDF, the brass, because they kept warning that if we do this, a regional war would start. If we do that, a regional war. Our interest was a regional war. We needed a regional war to take out Iran because we would not have another chance. And so on the eve of the beeper operation, someone of the brass of the IDF, most probably Herzi Halevi himself, the chief of staff, leaked to Ronen Bergman in Yediot Achronot. He also writes for the New York Times. Ronen Bergman is basically the mouthpiece for Herzi Halevi, that the government is about to decide something rash that can drag Israel to a regional war. 15 hours before the beeper operation, the chief of staff of the IDF or someone close to him try to sabotage and risk the whole operation because they know better than elected politicians and they think of themselves as gatekeepers. This is how I named my podcast, ironically, because this is the rotten mentality that underlies the rule of bureaucrats.
What's your podcast called?
Gatekeeper. They are the gatekeeper, and their job is to restrain politicians. And this is what they try to do. Imagine if someone at Hezbollah had read this with the proper frame of mind, it might have just ruined the whole beeper operation, which was prepared for years. And reportedly, the chief of staff said to the prime minister, the fact that you have a gadget doesn't mean that you have to play with it. And so on the night leading to October 7, the real story is insubordination. Why did you not wake up the Minister of Defense and the Prime Minister when there was such imminent danger? And the answer is, we don't trust them. We think they are wild and can drag us into a war, which means that these are bastions of an anti-democratic spirit in which the people can't be trusted and their elected officials can't be trusted. And we are here to prevent them from taking this train off the tracks.
So what you've just said is parallel to what you said earlier about the congregation of the councils of presidents, and that's the presidents of Jewish organizations, being told about this Islamofascism in the United States inciting violence against Jews and others, and thinking that making that information available would incite something.
Yeah. You know, this is exactly the same mentality if you look at the Democrats. What was the response of Biden's administration to the anti-Semitic riots on campuses in the aftermath of October 7th? They created a task force for combating Islamophobia. So that's their frame of mind. But that's the Obama frame of mind for international politics, right? The way to deal with Iran is not to aggravate them. And this is, you know, all these postmodernists and students of Edward Said, which Obama is clearly one. In my mind, Obama is the first Edward Saidian president that America ever had. Then the problem with all these wild ideologies, it's our fault. It's a narcissistic, self-centered conception of the world where everything wrong with the third world is somehow our fault because of colonialism. And it doesn't matter that the same thing holds where colonialism never touched the ground. So everything is geared towards pacification, appeasement, as opposed to deterrence. And this is, if you look at Obama's personal history, this is a South Chicago social organizer in which the mentality is that if there is some thug in the neighborhood, then you hug him. Because if you give him love, if you give him a share, a stake in society, then it will be fine. But this is not social work. And we are not taking them seriously. And they are taking themselves very seriously. When Yahya Sinwar says that he wants to eat the livers of Jews, he means this. It is not a figure of speech. And what we saw, the horrors that we saw on October 7, I spoke on my podcast to some astute student of the Muslim Brotherhood who worked in the Israeli government in some capacity. And he said, nothing about October 7 is surprising. If you had read the Hadith and the Quran seriously, and if you would understand what the theology of Hassan al-Banna was, you would understand why these terrorists took a child and cut off his right hand and an opposite leg. Because this is what they learned that the Prophet did. And they were repeating a holy ceremony in what looks to Westerns as a chaotic, wallowing in sadistic evil, which it is, of course, but this is more structured than we think. And if we start taking them seriously, we would understand the threats. So that when Iran says that it will erase Israel off the map of the world, it means that when it has a nuclear weapon, it would use it. It means literally what it says. When they say that America is the devil, they mean it. When they burn an American flag, they mean it. When they burn Israeli children, they mean it. They would burn all of us if we can. So when you see in the Israeli press too, yes, context, right? There's context. This is what happens after 60 years of occupation. Never mind that Gaza was not occupied. Gaza was the pilot for a Palestinian state. If there is a Palestinian state, this would be the Palestinian state. Hamas, the majority in Judea and Samaria support Hamas, and worse, the Palestinian Authority rejoiced in October 7th. And what we don't talk about here, there were offshoots of the Fatah inside the invasion of October 7th. There is the idea that
Fatah is the Palestinian Authority.
Fatah is the Palestinian Authority, and the idea that we can we can think of them as separate entities. These are the radicals, and we will bring in the moderates. It's a difference of style, not of content.
Explain who these characters are, who are, we know the leadership has vastly changed in Hamas, but Mahmoud Abbas has been there for 20 years? He was elected to a 4-year term, and he's remained because Hamas would win if
he steps down.
Right.
Certainly. So the fantasy born out of the peace process is that the Palestinian national movement has matured and that it has become realistic. They see that we are not going away, so they have to reach some compromise with us. That is not the way the Palestinian Authority sees it. The Palestinian Authority is a terrorist organization. For our own convenience in the West, we invented a moderate faction. But the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria, what is called the West Bank, they brag about killing more Jews than Hamas in Judea and Samaria. So that there is now a report, of course the mainstream press would not touch it, called Policemen by Day, Terrorists by Night. These people who are in the security apparatus of the Palestinian Authority are moonlighting as terrorists, and many of them reach Israeli jails. As you know, there is a pay-for-slay program in which you get a monthly stipend or a monthly salary in proportion to the extent of damage you cause to Jews, measured in the length of your sentence in an Israeli jail. So if you get a life sentence, which is you get the highest salary as long as you are serving in jail. So
and since that person is in jail supposedly for life, of course that doesn't happen because they have to be traded for hostages, but who gets that money? Their family?
Yeah. It's a way of making a living. The Palestinian Authority incentivizes terror. If someone dies in an act of terror while killing Jews, their family get a lifetime stipend. And secondly, the people who work or in the payroll of the Palestinian Authority also moonlight as terrorists, and many of them are in Israeli jails. So, and now the crucial thing to know about our peacenik army, our peacenik brass, is that when they and Shabak report a terrorist attack, they mention the organizational affiliation of the terrorist, unless it's the Palestinian Authority, in which case they do not mention it. And they've been called out of this on this many times. And they are also, or some of the brass, are also implicated in the fake news campaign about settler violence. I'm not saying there is no settler violence. The settler violence is in no proportion to the Palestinian violence, and some of these people feel they are not protected by the IDF, so they can be quicker on the trigger. I don't want to defend anyone taking the law into their own hands, but the exaggeration in the press of the settler violence, along with the denial of the violence of the Palestinian Authority, is designed to do what? These are two elements in the same, two sides of the same equation. They are meant to sell to the Israeli public the fantasy that there is still a partner for peace, and that the problem in Judea and Samaria are the settlers, not the Palestinians. This is a lie. If you look at the campaign for the settlers' violence, some of it is financed by European money given to Breaking the Silence. Breaking the Silence are a bunch of liars, and their method is designed to be immune to fact-checking because they publish anonymous testimonies, and they've been caught lying many times. Now, so look what they're doing. This most extreme anti-Israeli propagandist organization is getting European money in order to bring evidence of settler violence. And what they do is, if Arab herdsmen steal cattle from Jews, then when the Jews take it back, it's reported as settler violence against the Arabs. That's the way, that's their modus operandi.
This was in the news that the Palestinian Authority would no longer participate in pay-for-slay. And then some reporting came out that something had happened in which I gather the Palestinian Authority set up a foundation that would pay instead of the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority would fund the foundation, something like that. So, do you know about what was that?
It's a fraud. Abbas is on record for saying that if they are out of every single penny of their budget, but still have money for the pay for slay, he doesn't call it that. It's the salaries of the shaheeds, the martyrs. Then they will spend their last penny on this, because again, we don't take them seriously. Who are the heroes of the Palestinian national movement? Only terrorists, only people who kill Jews. If you go to Judea and Samaria, who do they name a square after, a school after? Who do they put the statue of? Who are the heroes of their children's story? Only martyrs who kill Jews. This is the idea that we can see the Palestinian national movement in the way, through the image of ourselves, in the way we perceive our own national movements, and so believe that their aim, like ours, is political independence, is completely wrong. Their whole set of terms is wrong. Their epistemology is different. Everything is completely different. And at the core of their national movement is the destruction of Zionism. They call it the right of return. It's not a right, and it's not even a return now, because the people who are supposed to return were never here. And UNRWA, which is the institution which perpetuates the so-called Palestinian refugee problem, because they're not refugees, many of them are citizens, they've been resettled. The purpose of this is to use the idea of refugees in order to delegitimize and then destroy Zionism. The way that our immune system is broken, they've figured it out. So you have members of Knesset who supported Arafat preaching to Israelis that they are racists. And this speaks perfectly to all the human rights organizations, right? We're not really protecting human rights. They are post-colonial woke ideologues, and their view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has nothing to do with human rights. It just says that Israel is the bad side and the Palestinians are the victims. We are the colonialists and they are the indigenous people, and we have occupied and crushed them. That's the view of the conflict. And when they have a human rights organization, it doesn't care about human rights, because the idea of human rights is that they are universal. If you care about the rights of one side and not the other, then you don't support human rights, you support the rights of one side. And you can see this everywhere. Look, Haaretz, the woke newspaper in Israel, say they have a principled stance against transfer, against moving populations. Do they really? No, they are in favor of tearing out the whole Jewish population of Judea and Samaria. They have a principled stance in which the principle is that the Palestinians are right and we have no right to be here. That's their principled stance. And human rights can only be used when they are against us. This is why B'Tselem, which is probably the most prominent Israeli human rights organization, when Bassem Eid, a Palestinian who worked for B'Tselem, brought reports about violation of human rights that the Palestinian Authority commits, they said, no, we won't publish that. And they did not, because they are not motivated by human rights. They are motivated by delegitimizing Zionism. And we have the same problem with the parts of the peace movement that have turned completely post-colonial and have become our enemies. Look, it's not a pleasant thing to say, but many liberal Jews in America have become enemies of Israel. I'm not using this word in a callous way. They have become enemies of the state of Israel. Someone like J Street, who in the middle of an existential war is demanding an embargo on weapons to Israel, is an enemy. It's not, there are no two ways about it. You are trying to sabotage our war effort in which our existential interests are involved. So how should we call this? Are we supposed to be friends with these people? I think we should stop. I think we should start calling them out. The whole of the mainstream media has become an industry of demonizing the right. What people don't realize outside Israel is how terrible the rifts are here. And the left has basically been behaving, or parts of it, as if the real enemy is Netanyahu, And Hamas, if not an ally, is at least a lucky incident which will help take down Netanyahu, because we can stick this failure to him, which doesn't really make that much sense. Because on the one hand, it's easy to say, well, it's your watch and this happened, so clearly you have a responsibility, which is true. But the reason this happened is because we left Gaza. Had we not left Gaza, this would never have happened, clearly. So the real mistake, and what Israelis realized on October 7, is that the whole turn that we took in the Oslo Accords, in the idea of a compromise, peace, solution to the conflict, all that was wrong. And we are getting another Hamastan now under the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria. So if you were on the Israeli left, or the Biden administration for that matter, your first thought after October 7 was, how do I rescue the two-state solution after Israelis saw who the other side is? And so what you need to do, if you want to influence public opinion after that, is the same thing that you do in the settlers' violence campaign. You need to blame Israel for this. So it's the occupation, and then the right is worse. The right is the big danger. Because if you want to maintain hope, and you are a peacenik on the Israeli side, then the one thing you can afford to recognize is that there's no partner for peace on the other side. So you have to construct a narrative, as they have, in which the reason we don't have peace is Israel. Once there was a very brave man named Rabin, the narrative goes, and Rabin, the old soldier, decided to take off his uniform and reach out with an olive branch to Yasser Arafat. And this was, as they called it then, the peace of the brave, Shalom shel Amitzim. And then, according to this narrative, what happened is Baruch Goldstein, in February of 94, an American-born Jewish settler walked into the tomb of the patriarchs and slaughtered, murdered, praying people from their back, 29 killed, 125 wounded, until they managed to kill him. So that brought about a reaction from the Palestinians. Remember? Escalation, miscalculation. So now came Palestinian terrorism. But that too did not, these were the enemies of peace on both sides, we were told. So now nobody asks, who is the moderate? We know who the peace movement is on our side, but who are the moderates on their side? Allegedly Yasser Arafat. And then came Yigal Amir and murdered Rabin, and with 3 bullets, he killed the peace process. If you cling to that narrative, you still have hope, because it's our fault, and we can mend it. It's like the Obama frame of mind. It's always us. It's never them. They are just a blank slate on which we project that we can mold.
I mean, on the one hand, it's a strength to say, when problems happen, what was my role? And then you can solve them, because if you're only blaming other people, you become a victim and you can never solve anything. You're just a perpetual victim. Yeah. So on the one hand, there's that strength. On the other hand, isn't it sort of a bit of a historical Jewish pathology that we are always looking at how we caused whatever damage was done to us?
Yeah, it's a consoling view in exactly the way you said it is. Because if that's the case, then we have a cure for anti-Semitism. And Jews repeatedly internalize these negative stereotypes. And then if you look at the anti-Netanyahu movement, for them normality is post-Jewish. And as my friend Irit Linur says, their idea of Zionism is Sweden in Hebrew. So we will get away from all these unpleasant Jews and their comfortable, warm little swamp, and step into the light of Enlightenment, modern globalism. And we will go to the same conference and be like all other peoples. And that idea is, if we stop being so awfully Jewish, then people will stop hating us. And as the joke goes, what is anti-Semitism? It is hating Jews more than is absolutely necessary. So these people are the absolutely necessary. There is an absolutely necessary hatred of the Jews, and let's finally move away from all these messianic, traditional, deplorable clingers and all the other catchphrases for those who refuse to modernize. Then this meets, I think, a mood on the left globally. I mean, in the whole West, where what you say is that self-criticism is actually a good thing. You need self-criticism if you want to improve. But then if it becomes a ritual, then self-flagellation becomes a ritual of purifying rather than actual sober criticism that allows you to improve. So you stop looking at the other, you neglect their responsibility, and now you indulge in a narcissistic ritual of self-flagellation which purifies you, after which you are purified. And if you look at how this happened in academia, whole branches of academia were completely corrupted. If you look at anthropology books, I have Clifford Geertz is one of my favorites, is once they studied indigenous people, but they had a methodological introduction saying, look, we have our own biases, we don't know, we can't see them completely objectively, but we immerse ourselves in their society and imaginatively identify and understand them. And then you look at anthropology books, and the introduction just became larger and larger at the expense of the field study, and in the end you're left just with an introduction. And this is, the Edward Said mentality. We are only going to look at ourselves. What is postmodernism? It is the study of one's own text. That's what it is. So the postmodern scholar, instead of looking at the world, has turned around and is looking only at his own text and searching. Clifford Geertz called it epistemological hypochondria. So what is still wrong with my biases? But the whole turn of postmodernism is the study of disciplines. Ever since Foucault, what is Edward? I once was crazy enough to read Orientalism cover to cover in search of any assertion about the Arab world. And I think I found two. He's not interested in the Arab world at all. So when there is a statement about the Arabs, he only asks about the scholar who wrote it and his interests. He never asks, is it true? So that, as I tell students, the key to understand all postmodern writing is there is no truth. And therefore, we shouldn't ask what is true. We should only ask who decides and for what purpose. And the answer is always the same. It's like a sausage machine. Whatever you put into it, you get the same sausage. Because the answer is always the hegemonic group in order to perpetuate its own superiority or its own mastery of the other or of the margin. So you have the same question, the same answer, no matter where you go. And my late mother used to say that postmodernism will die of boredom because it's just mind-numbing. You sit in these classes. I remember being a PhD student and you're studying. There's a class on the Cold War, and we're examining phallic metaphors in Kennedy's Cold War speeches. And there was almost a nuclear war in Cuba. Is that what's interesting now? And you just sit there. I ended up quitting class and doing only independent studies. They're also extremely domineering in their ideology. So if you argue in class, they give you hell. I had one teacher walk out in the middle of my speaking in his class. He just collected his stuff and walked out without saying anything. And I'll say for the department that he got reprimanded. I guess I was outspoken. I'm an Israeli, but my criticism of the piece that we read, I had an argument. But there are arguments you're not allowed to voice, even if other people around you also think so, and they do. It's just you can't say the truth.
You're making me think about a problem with the postmodern lens. And one of the problems is that it doesn't see itself as a lens. And so your professor couldn't hear whatever you were saying because you were coming from a different perspective, not using the postmodern lens. And it is it's like gibberish. There's the one thing about paradigms is that when you're in one, you can't tell. You can't see what it is. You can see other people's paradigms, but you can't see your own. You think you are just seeing things the way they are. And the postmodern lens is a way of kind of fooling people into thinking that they are seeing things the way they are, rather than, some other kind of disciplinary lens where you're using a lens.
Isn't it ironic? Because they are the ones who are insisting that you can't see anything outside your lens. But the way they conceive themselves is, since they know that, we can trust them. After that, we can trust them. And you see, my PhD was part of it was about Richard Rorty, and wrought unimaginable damage to Western academia because he translated French postmodernism into American liberalism, convincing Americans that if you are a relativist and you have no foundational values, then you are more tolerant. And this is clearly not the same. If you don't have an argument against the Nazis because everything is relative, then you are not more liberal and more tolerant. Then you are leaving all arbitration of ideas to power. And that's it. And this is exactly the illusion. The illusion is that if you think that all values are created equal, then you are more democratic. And the whole postmodern academia rides on that wave, and it ends up what? It ends up defending Islamofascists. And when I say that we have lost our immune system, is that in that junction exactly, in which you embrace those who would destroy you. And those who would destroy you, if you touch them, they scream racism, right? Ilhan Omar, the supporter of Hamas, is so sensitive to racism. And so when I say that the woke and the postcolonial don't believe in human rights, they're also not against racism. They're only against racism when it's employed by the group they call hegemonic. They are ardent supporters and defenders of Arab racism against Jews. And you're not allowed to criticize Arabs because that is Islamophobia. So look at this, they're not against racism. They are supporters of affirmative action racism. So the racism of the downtrodden is to be commended. It was most clear in the aftermath of October 7th with American radical feminism, in which the very people, as Batya Unger-Sargon has pointed out, the very people who said, believe her, whatever she said, you don't need evidence. If she felt this way, then this is the truth. These people, as she said, turned on a dime, and now the rape of Israeli women, and I'm not going to mention the horrors of this sexual sadism here, that is suddenly, this may be armed resistance. Well, we're not sure it's sexual violence, and we need more evidence. And there is a context to this. So Judith Butler, the oracle of queer theory and postmodern feminism, suddenly took a step back and wondered, do we really know that Hamas did anything that is not legitimate armed resistance? Because after all, they are the victims in this struggle.
Yeah, but actually what she said was that it wasn't anti-Semitic.
Yeah, that too. Anti-Semitism is a trap for her, right? Because in that worldview, it's in a sense, its grid is amoral. It only understands strong and weak. And if you're weak, then no matter what you do, you can burn a baby. But if the baby is Jewish and is part of the oppressor class, then that baby being burnt by a Palestinian terrorist is the baby's fault. It's the baby's fault. The baby is the problem here. And this is how they look. This is the whole lens through which, this seeps into, it's not just Judith Butler, who arguably is on the far, far postmodern end.
Well, but let me just say something about Judith Butler. She, at one point, said that she was uncomfortable with what happened on October 7th. And
uncomfortable.
Yeah. Right.
So was I.
Right. But I mean, just a glimpse of her humanity, that she she wasn't happy about it, that she didn't like what happened. And her acolytes turned on her for saying that.
Yeah, for being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because she's trying to sell this view, and she needs to maneuver in such a way that people who have seen the horrors will still relate to her, and she will not be like completely crazy. But Judith Butler, the simple key for understanding all this is superficial. And I think what we don't understand about postmodernism, and that's maybe for another conversation, is we keep thinking about it as cultural Marxism, but we don't see the American element of radical individualism in this. Because if you read Judith Butler, in the end, all gender trouble, in the end, it's not that far from Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Right.
It's not that far from John Wayne, because what was the self-made man is now the self-made transgendered individual. That's what it is. But Judith Butler is on the radical end. But look at the Biden administration and look at Kamala Harris. They have been telling us that Israel has also committed atrocities, right? They were playing into the court at The Hague. Violence should stop because there are victims on both sides, and Israel is committing war crimes. They kept hinting that there are war crimes. So they assigned the Palestinian deaths to Israeli responsibility, while the Palestinians were putting civilians in harm's way as human shields. And
human
according
sacrifices, really.
But in international law, if you use human shields, you are responsible for their deaths. So all this media campaign in which you see dead Palestinian babies, that a really moral person should look at that and say, that blood is on the hands of Hamas. And indeed, Yahya Sinwar used to say this, our women and children are the dam which will stop the decline of the Palestinian people. So their bodies would be sacrificed to the cause, and it's a holy cause, and there will be martyrs. But we in the West, and the whole media is like that. You see a picture of a dead baby and an IDF soldier, and you're supposed to connect them. Now look at the New York Times, because the New York Times now published that there are dead children with bullets that we know come from Israeli rifles. And if you just looked at the bragging of the Hamasniks when they return Israeli hostages, they have Israeli weapons. It could have come from their guns. And we know that they shot their own civilians if they dared escape from combat areas. There is no army in the world, and there is no campaign in history in which any army took such caution not to hurt civilians as collateral damage. There is a report, a joint Israeli-American report, in which this is the most densely populated area and the hardest for urban warfare. And we have managed to keep the ratio of civilian deaths to combatant deaths below 3. The assessment is 1.5 to 3. If you take the international average, it's 7 to 9 civilians per combatant casualty. So we have not just been extra careful, we have been uniquely successful in the face of an enemy who is trying to maximize their own deaths as a means of propaganda against us. So this whole righteous reprimand of Israel and the demonization of Israel in the international media is an outrage. And we have been told at every stage of this war that if you just go in there would be horrendous civilian casualties. Notably Rafah. You remember that Kamala Harris said she studied the map and there is no way to take out this population. Well, we did. We moved 1 million people out of harm's way, and we'll keep doing that. You know, it's my opinion that nobody should have returned to the north of the Gaza Strip, and we should have annexed that part and settled it with Jews. Because we keep thinking in Western terms, for that side, death is not an issue. These are all martyrs. They're going to heaven. Destruction of buildings is certainly not an issue. Aid money would come and there would be plentiful employment in the construction business in Gaza. And the one price that theologically, if you take their theology serious, that their theologians say this is This trumps jihad. You should stop jihad if that's the price. And they talk about land. Yeah. So if we take away land, this war would register in their memory, not as Yahya Sinwar being the new Saladin, but as a war that should not have been started because the price was too high. And we should exact a price that's too high. In the West, we keep talking about proportional. Deterrence is disproportionality. If you lay one slap on your wife, you are going to 4 years in jail. Is that proportional? Well, if you ask me if I prefer a slap or 4 years in jail, I prefer a slap. Deterrence is achieved by disproportional punishment. And we should exact a price as to make clear for all the bigger sharks in this area, not the Hamas, which is the weakest of our enemies. They should understand that if you hurt us, you will pay a price too steep that you do not want to pay.
Well, let's be clear that the conversation about proportionality in war is not about this kind of thing. Proportionality is about not using force that's excessive to what your goals are. So, if it's
that's not how it's phrased in the liberal press here, because they say, look, how many Israelis were killed?
Right.
1,400. And 600 more soldiers, say 2,000. How many Palestinians were killed? They take the numbers from Hamas, so probably.
Yeah, you're right. So in the sort of vernacular, proportionality is used sort of that way.
Yeah.
The way that you're using it is appropriate to that conversation, and that's an interesting way to think about what price is high enough that it is a deterrent. In the north, there's a buffer zone now, right? A demilitarized zone. Is there a similar thing being considered for Gaza?
In the north, there is not enough of a buffer zone. We should remain present in a large swath of southern Lebanon. And we should stop thinking about the results of all wars as reversible. That's not how it is. In most conflicts, in most historical times. If you start a war against a country, you can lose territory. Ask the Hungarians. They lost 2/3 of their country, and they're not getting it back because they lost this war. Ask the Germans. They lost some of the eastern part of their country. They're not getting it back. And nobody is asking to get it back, and nobody's asking to return refugees or move populations. If you start a war against Israel, you lose territory. And if it was up to me, and possibly with the support of an American administration that is more hawkish, like the Trump administration, I'd say Lebanon lost territory. And ideally, we should annex it. You tried to fight us. You lost. Now you pay a price for that. But in Israel's war, everything is always reversible. If we gain some territory, we always have to give it up. If we made any other advances, we need to give them up. Why do we need to give them up? We were not the aggressors here. And clearly in the case of Gaza, we were not even occupiers. And then there's the argument that there was a siege. We saw there was no siege. There was an open border with the Egyptians. So...
Well, there was a closed border with the Egyptians because they closed it.
Yeah, now they did. But we discovered their underground highways for smuggling everything. So there was not even a real siege. Gaza had whatever weapons it wanted to.
You mean a blockade, right?
The blockade.
Yeah.
The blockade was supposed to be an embargo on weapons. It's not a blockade to starve them. Which, by the way, a complete siege is also legal according to international law. So Israel, if it was not held by a vice grip between its wild left and a sympathetic to that wild left administration in America, we would say not a single truck of humanitarian aid is entering Gaza until you return all our hostages.
And that's where we are right now, right? There's no aid going in?
There's, Israel is not a democracy. It is ruled by unelected judges who have taken into their hands sovereignty itself. defined as the final authority of decision-making about everything, including the writing of a constitution. They have now taken for themselves judicial review over constitutional amendments. We don't have a constitution, we have semi-constitutional laws. But now the court will decide what constitutional laws we can have. And now the intermediary representatives of the Nazis in Gaza have appealed to the Supreme Court against stopping the humanitarian aid, and the Supreme Court has accepted the petition for discussion. They should have thrown it out immediately, and the government in Israel should say, you can rule whatever you want, this is a political issue, and we're not listening to you. But they can't, because we are held in a vice grip of a permanent bureaucracy that has managed to completely subordinate electoral politics.
You're saying that some Hamas representative took this case to the Israeli...
No, the Hamas can't bring the case directly, but all these human rights organizations and NGOs that submit petitions in the name of the prisoners in Israel, there's a whole industry of these NGOs, so they have now appealed in the name of the interests of the Gazans to the Israeli Supreme Court against the Israeli government, after the Israeli government got the support of the Trump administration. Let me remind you that Giora Eilen, a former general who's by no means on the right, says that the reason we don't have the hostages until now is the Biden administration, because it forced us to give them humanitarian aid. And according to international law, you can threaten a population with starvation if they hold your people hostages, if that's the only way to win a war. But we are far more cautious than international law demands. And of course, the American administration framed this as war crimes, and so threatened to stop our ammunition. So we were under their thumb. But now we have to deal with our own Supreme Court. And the reason we got here, in part, is the fact that the judicial junta in Israel eroded the parameter zones so that Hamas got nearer and nearer to the fence. And ironically...
Say what it used to be. It used to be that if they came within a certain amount, they would get a warning shot. What was the...
Oh, there was a shoot-to-kill zone. Under Doron Almog, the former, by the way, part of his family suffered the
Haifa... First, the Almog family was in the Haifa Maxim's bombing, and then some of his family were Kfar Aza, I believe.
Yeah. They were victims of the October 7th too. Doron Almog was commander of the Southern Theater, a general, and under his command there was in some places 1 kilometer, which was a death zone, shoot-to-kill zone. If anyone enters, a shot to the head, and that was very effective. No one got near the fence. But then NGOs started submitting petitions to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is hiding behind the fact that in the end they rejected the petitions. But if they don't throw them out immediately, then begins a process in which the state is attempting to defend itself so as to avoid a ruling against it. And in that intermediary space, the Supreme Court has completely eroded the buffer zone. And it did, every time the state comes and they say, and the judges say, well, we have written down your commitment to do this and that. And so first you can't shoot to kill, then you can't shoot above the waist, then you can't shoot above the knee, then you can only shoot an ankle, then you have to shoot only if you have definite proof that this is a terrorist. And so what Hamas did, and I wrote about this, and so I studied it in depth. Israel used sharpshooters in 2018 in what was called the return marches, as in the right of return.
The March of Return.
The March of Return.
Yeah.
And what they did in these marches is civilians marched to the fence. And so imagine how far we got from the shoot to kill order by Doron Almog in the year 2000. So now we used sharpshooters, and they were vilified in the Israeli press as murderers murderers of children. You remember that? That's the same accusation that we hear now. Because some of the people they shot at were 17-year-old Hamas operatives who are photographed in uniform with weapons on Hamas websites. So they are children because they're under 18. And the fact was that the poor guys who had to do the sharpshooting, imagine that task, and they then are called murderers, did the most careful surgical job in which 95% of the time they managed to neutralize without killing Hamas operatives. And they almost always chose the right agitators and almost never hit civilians. But since I studied this, I know all the press said, why don't you use rubber bullets? Why don't you use smoke grenades? Well, that doesn't work in an open environment. You can't use smoke grenades against a crowd outside. And also rubber bullets are notoriously imprecise. So you might take someone's eye out accidentally. So sharpshooting live ammunition is actually the way to reduce harm. But how easy it is to portray this in the press, right? The evil Israeli military is putting sharpshooters with live ammunition shooting into civilian crowds full of children. And the whole lie was constructed in a piece in the New York Times around a baby called Laila Gandour. And she was 8 months old. She allegedly died from inhaling smoke from IDF grenades. And it then turned out that, first of all, why do you blame Israel for such a thing? You should ask, who are the wild people who take a baby into a zone where there's a clash with the army? Who is the crazy mother to do such a thing? And they said this was her sister. She was 12-year old. She panicked. She didn't know where to go, blah, blah, blah. Turns out this baby died of heart failure in the hospital. And they brought the corpse to the front in order to blame the IDF. And then the New York Times publishes this piece with a picture that looks like the Paeta, like, baby Jesus. It's like this dead baby in our mother's arm, and the whole composition of the picture is Bethlehem. And it's like, this blood libel, embedded in this, religious kitsch, in order to incite maximum hatred and disgust at these awful Jews.
Did the New York Times ever print a correction? I
don't know that they did. I had an exchange around this in Haaretz, but I can tell you Haaretz never apologized when they publish blood libels. Why? Because they feel that they know who the evil side is, and if they exaggerate a little, well, it's for a good cause. That's how they see themselves.
Wasn't there some recent thing with Haaretz losing government funding or something? What's the thing that's been going on with Haaretz?
Amos Shoker, the publisher of Haaretz, spoke in a conference in the middle of the war in London, and he said that the people that Israeli call Palestinian terrorists are actually freedom fighters. And a Palestinian state is a necessity, and the way to achieve it is to impose sanctions on Israel as a country. And also he called for sanctions against the persons of the leadership of Israel. So there you are in the middle of the war. The publisher of Haaretz is calling for sanctions against the country in the middle of a war. Now, Haaretz is an anti-Zionist paper. They keep denying it, but that's what they are. And they've not just been publishing for 30 years now. Their literary supplements give front and center to postcolonial academics. They have been publishing blood libels against our soldiers, and the whole coverage of the occupation is subordinate to the cause of blaming Israel for wars and for our inability to achieve peace. And on the eve of the war, Aluf Ben, the editor of Haaretz, published a piece, said, it's time to take the word Jewish out of the phrase Jewish and democratic. This is a direct call for abandoning Zionism in favor of a non-national state in which, which can probably incorporate the Gaza and Judea and Samaria, and renounce the Jewish character of the state. And then he abandoned that after the war began, not surprisingly. And the reason he did this in this, overt way. They've been doing it covertly for a long time. They've been like undermining the foundations of Zionism, but suddenly they declared their anti-Zionism. And you ask yourself, why now? And the reason is, this is September, before the war. And the reason is, it was clear that judicial reform was defeated and that the power of the Supreme Court has been established and even augmented. And the Supreme Court holds a radical, progressive, woke view, which would probably be sympathetic to this non-Zionist view. And the way to make Israel not Jewish, the only way, is to subdue its democracy. Because if you have a Jewish majority and universal suffrage, then the majority supports a Jewish state. So now there was a power stronger than electoral politics, and so Aluf Ben probably thought, this is a good time to give these people courage to do the right thing, because now the danger of democracy has been averted. Then came October 7th, and suddenly the idea of abandoning the Jewish state did not look like such a good idea. The left has closed down a right-wing media outlet here. The single case in Israeli history, it was a radio station of the right, and the Supreme Court shut it down. The right has never shut an outlet. When Ben-Gurion tried to shut the communist newspaper, the Supreme Court defended it and it stayed open. So there's only one case of a media outlet being shut, and that's on the right. And Haaretz, whenever you touch them, they scream bloody murder. What do I mean by touch them? Why does the government, by advertising in Haaretz, why does the government give all the civil service, anyone who wants can get a subscription for Haaretz at the taxpayer's expense? Why should we help finance a newspaper, the publisher of which is calling to sanction Israel in the midst of a war? Why should we? So suddenly they got the courage to do it, because this was a very clear case. Is that a danger for Haaretz? Is it in danger of being shut down? No. You raise your subscription. We don't have to pay for your slandering of Israel. And look what is happening abroad. Jeffrey Goldberg, by no means a right-winger, said he canceled his subscription to Haaretz because he gets too many links from neo-Nazis to Haaretz. And if you look at neo-Nazi sites, take the Daily Stormer. The Daily Stormer sees itself as the offshoot of Der Stürmer, of Julius Streicher under the Nazis. It has hundreds of references to Haaretz, because that's the self-testimony of the Jews. So when Gideon Levy writes a piece entitled "Stop Living in Denial, Israel is an Evil State," when he said that, the Jews are evil. They are saying they're evil. Who are we to judge them? Then you look at David Duke, hundreds of references to Haaretz. So they are probably the most effective producer of anti-Semitic material worldwide. And since it's considered self-testimonials, then it's considered uniquely authoritative. What has fallen apart with the Biden administration is also, hopefully, the machinery of lies. They had a way that's what they did with the Iran nuclear deal, right? That's what Ben Rhodes is famous for. They created an echo chamber in which they misled the public. They had their own pundits responding. They controlled the media. And so they basically could impose a lie and make it feel like a consensus. And that, I think, collapsed in the debate between Trump and Biden. Suddenly people said, wait, you have been lying to us for 3 years about on one, he's sharp as a tack, right? And then we switched to Kamala Harris and joy, and we're supposed to swap. So this machine fell apart because, first of all, because Elon Musk had bitten a whole huge chunk of it when he bought Twitter. And then there's Trump himself, and then there's Netanyahu. And I think what Netanyahu is trying to do is that there is, except the war, there is a war of narratives. One narrative, which the Biden administration the left in Israel, Haaretz, the whole liberal media establishment, and the whole of academia is imposing on the conflict here, is that Zionism is the rear guard of Western colonialism, which we should do away with. And then there is the Netanyahu narrative, which says Zionism is actually the avant-garde. It's the forefront of the struggle of the West against its enemies. And so one narrative says, the jihad is just armed resistance. It's a response to the guilt of the West, and we should make amends and reparations. And the other side says, no, these are our mortal enemies. We should take them seriously. And Israel is the forefront of this struggle. And this is what he said to Congress and got a standing ovation for, I think 37 times. Our war is your war. Our victory will be your victory, because the West must shake off its post-colonial illusions, see the enemy for what it is, and rally behind us.